Welcome to this fourth annual Rhodes Centre lecture on the ethics of capitalism, which is jointly sponsored by the President's Office. When this lecture series got started in 2020, it happened because some students did their own research on the internet. And in doing so, they decided that the founder of IBM and the father of the benefactor of the Watson Institute was in fact a Nazi. He wasn't. And we put together a committee and investigated the whole thing. 100% guy was not a Nazi. There were lots and lots of American companies that were filled with Nazis, but IBM was not one of them. But, you know, that's the perils of doing your own research on the internet. Anyway, the university undertook a serious investigation of the issue and concluded that this is not the case. But what we probably should do is to have a kind of annual lecture that makes us think about the underlying ethics of capitalism, because we probably don't reflect on these things enough. So today we welcome Brown's Seth Rockman to talk to us about the ethics of capitalism and his particular genre that we'll be getting shortly. I've known Seth since joining Brown, and I've always been intrigued by his research on the history of slavery and capitalism. In Europe, we still have a thing called economic history, which exists as a discipline. And in the US, it was somewhat expelled from the temple in the 1970s. And I always wondered if Seth's project was a way of smuggling it back into the back door with a cultural front on it that the field would recognize. It is, after all, a study of capitalism, regardless of its point of entry. But if you've spent any time in the US, and I've been here for 34 years, not 43 years, then you know that you really can't examine any of the basic institutions of American life without reference to slavery, or at least race. It itself is a foundational institution of the country. What Seth's work has taught me is that these two institutions are not just intertwined historically, they are deeply imbricated with each other and mutually instantiating. You literally cannot have one without the other. Seth's new book, which he's not going to talk about directly today, but in good capitalist spirit, you can get the flyer there and get 30% off if you scan the QR code. So I encourage you to do so. His new book, Plantation Goods, A Material History of American Slavery, brings us home in many ways. Whether it's the New England manufacturers of planters' hoes and axes, all destined for the southern trade, or the weavers of coarse fabrics intended to clothe slaves, whether it's the New England families where one half profits from supplying the material infrastructure of slavery, while the other half campaigns as abolitionists, that actually went on, or whether it's the supply chain, the middlemen, my favorite chapter in the book actually, and their financiers trying to overcome problems of liquidity and payment. Each chapter gives us a different aspect of the development of US capitalism that does much more than use the economics of Southern slavery as a case study. Rather, it shows us exactly how the two institutions really are inseparable. All of which brings us to ethics. In each of Seth's chapters, he raises a version of the same question. The folks doing all this trade that enabled the institution of slavery to continue, from the seamstresses of New England and the convicts of Pennsylvania making fabrics, to the second sons of northern families opening stores in Kentucky and Tennessee frontier, the emerging markets of the 1840s, did they have doubts? Did they have qualms? Did they have concerns about what they were doing? And his answer seems to be, not really. Which tells us something about capitalism that we've heard in prior lectures in this series. That capitalism isn't this thing that suffers from occasional ethical lapses, that when light is shined upon it, it basically self-corrects. Instead, the capitalism has a master ethic, and that master ethic is profit. Without profit, there can be no capitalism. So everything else really is secondary. In the 1840s and 1850s in the US, that profit ethic overrode concerns with the sanctity of human life and the autonomy of the self. In the current moment, last year's speaker, Xavier Blyth, reminded us it allows the commodification of nature on a planetary scale in the face of a climate crisis. It allows and in fact feeds upon what Frances Haugen told us 3 years ago concerning knowledge of the destructive effect of digital technologies on the millions of young people who use Facebook and the basic security of millions of people in the developing world who use Facebook as the digital infrastructure for the country. And it also allows us, as David de Jong told us 2 years ago, to analyze the descendants of those people who Aryanized Jewish businesses in Germany and continue to book billions in dividends today because of these moves. Seth is now Professor of History at Brown, effective July 1st, 2025. His new book, Plantation Goods, is a finalist for the Business History Conference's Hagley Prize and a finalist for the Mark Linton Prize for the Columbia School of Journalism's, quote, a book-length work of history on any topic that best combines intellectual distinction with felicity of expression. I can assure you none of my writing has ever been so described. So that's an epic one if you get it. Simultaneously with this lecture, there is a university award ceremony taking place in Pembroke Hall where Seth will be receiving an absentia, because he hasn't cloned himself yet, the School of Professional Studies Distinguished Faculty Award for participation in the EMBA program. So his scholarship and his teaching are both being recognized today. So without any further ado, I present Seth Rockman to talk about the antebellum origins of American business ethics.
Thank you, Mark, for that very warm introduction. Thank you, Ali, for organizing and all the logistics that went into this. And thanks to all of you for coming inside on a shockingly beautiful day. It is very kind of you to step in here and to spend the next hour talking about business ethics and their history. So I'll speak for maybe about 45 or so minutes, and then there'll be plenty of time for questions and answers. I have some images to show you, and off we go. So, the moral precepts governing economic activity have varied across human societies, and the behavioral codes of modern capitalism are of relatively recent origins. When the term business ethics first appeared as a term business ethics in the American commercial press, it was in the middle decades of the 19th century. But even at that time, its concerns were hardly novel. Often warning against the possession of one conscience on Sunday and another one on Monday. But the increasingly complex organization of the American economy in the middle decades of the 19th century largely jeopardized this and made it more difficult for rectitude and justice and benevolence and truth-telling to be the organizing sort of dimensions of the laws of trade. And to that extent, ever new questions arose regarding what new corporations might mean, new questions of moral duties for people who were acting under the guise of that legal fiction. And at the same time, social pressures rose when people were confronted with an economy that was full of opportunities to do quite horrible things, whether those things might be like distilling liquor or transporting opium or profiting from convict labor, marketing life insurance, and of course, most notably, brokering in commodities grown by enslaved people, or even worse, brokering enslaved people themselves. With all these dilemmas in play in the first decades of the 19th century, one might imagine any number of different kinds of outcomes. One might be the acceleration of a prescriptive literature that sought to bring business practices in greater accordance with a kind of universal ethics. Ministers, journalists, and jurists drew on the entirety of the Western tradition, from Aristotelian ethics to New Testament parables, from Enlightenment moral philosophy into Unitarian theology, in pursuit of moral precepts that might guide commercial relations under this new regime. The print culture of this era attested to the urgency of this project in titles such as Henry Boardman's The Bible in the Counting House, or Freeman Hunt's Worth and Wealth, a collection of maxims, morals, and miscellanies for merchants and men of business. Don't say that fast too often. In the middle here, you see a detail from William Van Doren's Mercantile Morals, or Thoughts for Young Men Entering Mercantile Life, which, as you can see in the bottom, it says, "You may trust his honesty." For all of these kinds of writers, business ethics did not anticipate conflicts of interest or insider trading or other conundrums associated with the developing corporate structure, but they nonetheless were very much attentive to new possibilities for speculative investment, for being overextended in terms of one's debt financing, and of course with an awareness that individual malfeasance could generate communal suffering. Here more locally, Brown's own Francis Wayland played a particularly large role in setting the table for this conversation as someone in his published tracts on moral philosophy and sermons basically became the leading exponent of these ideas for American college students, both North and South. Collectively, this body of literature really did conceive of the business world as capable of transformative and ultimately positive social change that would further the American national project, that would promote global peace, and that would accelerate the creation of God's kingdom on earth. None of this work, let me be very clear, anticipated or presumed a world of atomized, utility-maximizing market actors each seeking their own self-interest. That would have been dystopian, and it's very important to keep that in mind. But there was indeed a counter-movement underway, a novel set of claims that would ultimately be triumphant and in whose shadows we have lived for much of our lives, an understanding of business as a discrete realm of human activity where different rules applied, and where the protection of the market as a differentiated space was deemed essential to its functioning and to its presumptive efficiency in distributing the fruits of the material world. A logic which, of course, undergirds such cliches as the business of business is business, or such axioms as Milton Friedman's shareholder theory of the firm, such that the social responsibility of business is to increase its profits, or that is behind such euphemistic sanitizing of harms like the term negative externalities that we hear in many business accounting classes. This is ultimately what Duncan Foley calls Adam's fallacy, a 19th century and 20th century misreading of an 18th century text, Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, a sprawling volume that said a lot of things, but just not that we should strive to have a world organized exclusively by the free reign of the invisible hand. The fallacy, according to Foley, is, quote, that it is possible to separate the economic sphere of life in which the pursuit of self-interest is guided by objective laws to a socially beneficial outcome from the rest of social life, in which the pursuit of self-interest is morally problematic and has to be weighed against other ends. The effort to effect that separation, the boundary work we might call it, functions as an animating question within the history of capitalism, a point that Ha-Joon Chang makes in another one of my favorite books, 23 Things They Don't Tell You About Capitalism, with the suggestion that what's in and what's out of the market, what's legitimately for sale and what's not for sale in the market, is not determined on the pages of political economic treatises and texts, but rather is worked at on the ground in business practice. So those who were arguing for what we might call separate spheres were merchants making claims in court, manufacturers forging new supply chains, financiers deciding on new kinds of investments, and so forth. Here we can see arguments that an ethical business practice was one that allowed for the market to exercise its presumptive organizational authority unimpeded by, ironically, the kind of ethics that governed other kinds of human relations. That is to say, a business ethics differentiated from an ethics. And to that extent, our quest today is to find this history of this version of American business ethics predicated on the sanctity of the market mechanism. And this is one that must be found in the frictions of commerce itself. So as we go through this today, I want to begin with an illustration of the problem at hand and provide some historical context. I then want to pull back and think more broadly about an intellectual framework for writing the history of American business ethics. And then I want to zoom back in on 19th century America to tell an antebellum origins story for this separation. Much of this is, as Mark Blyth mentioned, rooted in the research that went into my recent book, Plantation Goods, A Material History of American Slavery, which focused on the interregional trade in things like hats and hoes and shovels and shoes, boots and textiles, as they traveled from the northern communities where they were made to the southern communities where they were used. So let's begin with an interesting moment in 1856. On June 25th, 1856, John Deming lost his job as a hand in a Northampton, Massachusetts farm implement manufactory. He was fired for his fierce support of the new Republican Party and its presidential candidate, John C. Fremont. Just weeks after the caning of Charles Sumner, Deming was hardly alone among Western Massachusetts voters in his desire to curb the slave power. But Deming's anti-slavery politics proved intolerable to his employers at the Bay State Tool Manufacturing Company, an enterprise that produced hoes for use on slave plantations in the American South. Deming's firing was a public relations debacle for Bay State, particularly once the just-fired Deming read an anti-slavery poem by John Greenleaf Whittier at a huge Republican Party rally in Northampton. According to a newspaper account, Deming stood before a large banner containing a representation of the assault on Charles Sumner, with the words, "We shall subdue you," underneath, and above a large inscription that said, "Fremont and Freedom." Desperate to save his firm's reputation, Jonathan Bailey scrambled to set the record straight. He convinced 37 other operatives at the Bay State Company to sign a circular stating that, quote, "We've been told by our employers to enjoy freely our own political preferences and to vote for whomever we please." The Springfield Argus and the Hampshire Gazette published testimonials that insinuated that Deming had been fired for other reasons, perhaps for intemperance. Bailey also wrote a nervous letter to Oliver and Oakes Ames, from whom the company received much of the iron that it used to fabricate tools. Soon to be very prominent Republican Party politicos, the Ames brothers required an explanation for Deming's firing. And here's what Bailey wrote. He wrote, "I have to say that I'm no politician. I've not been to the ballot box for several years." But then he elaborated that it should not be the case that business and politics should be mixed up. And rather than, I suppose, addressing the particular relationship of Northern industry and Southern slavery, he advanced a general principle that no corporate enterprise should have any kind of party affiliation. Indeed, he went even further. This company was organized for the purpose of manufacturing hoes and forks. Political, religious, and moral questions are commodities that we do not deal in as a company. So let's pause on this for a moment, right? This claim. Is it possible to claim in the middle of the 1850s United States that you can put hoes into the market and take principles out? Is this, in fact, something that is plausible? Is this something that is laughable? Is this something that is commonsensical? And this is sort of the thing that I want to explore in the talk that follows. I want to think through the ways in which this idea of this demarcation, this separation, this division between a world of business and a world of everything else came into being, and whether or not this was in fact a novel claim, or whether this was a claim that had a longer history and, of course, a much longer future. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the moralization of all of this in antebellum America, and to think through on the level of particular industries, but also in the economic culture more generally. So, of course, we might start with the fact that by the end of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century, debates on the abolition of the Atlantic slave trade had shown how readily commercial practices might be reconceptualized as ethical dilemmas. But even as this might have led to the abolition of that slave trade in 1807 and 1808, and led to new notions of consumer responsibility when someone like William Fox instructed the tea drinkers of England that they might as well be holding the whip on a Jamaican plantation. Despite all that, by the middle of the 19th century in the United States, really only the smallest percentage of white Americans would have seen manufacturing hoes for slaves to use as a moral problem. Making hoes, of course, required the same tools and materials as fabricating shackles for slaving voyages. But the manufacturers of those items of items like this hoe, were not equally culpable in the evil of slavery. For a northern firm to make agricultural implements expressly adapted for the South was not tantamount to being a slaveholder. Temperance reformers contemporaneously might have faulted the timberman who sold barrel staves to a rum distiller, but abolitionists hesitated to indict the northern seamstress who stitched suits and dresses for slaves to wear. And very few people had things to say about these kinds of firms that employed dozens, if not scores, of families in their local communities in the pursuit of shoes, of tools, and of clothing for slave markets. It is, of course, the case, though, that the producers of these plantation goods could hardly isolate their businesses from other considerations so readily and so decisively as someone like Jonathan Bailey had asserted. To the contrary, northern businessmen in the southern trade would face a series of moral challenges and choices. Some could be resolved with deceptive ease. Would it have been better for the slaves not to have shoes? This was, in so many words, the position of Henry Wilson, the Natick, Massachusetts shoemaker who specialized in slave brogans before his political career carried him to the vice presidency in 1873. But other dilemmas were, in fact, quite thornier. Wilson reportedly rejected the offer of a Southern customer to sell his slaves in order to pay an overdue bill. But other Northern providers found themselves unexpectedly mired in the slave market when their customers defaulted on their debts. A Northern firm might gain legal ownership when Southern courts distributed the assets, that is to say, the slaves of an insolvent planter, factor, or merchant. And as one 1840s New England critic noted, there are hundreds of sober-faced Yankees whom nobody suspects of being implicated in such a disgraceful business. Southern nationalists and pro-slavery ideologues also did their part to make the plantation provisioning trade a moral one, or at least a testament to Northern hypocrisy and moral bankruptcy. The Northerners abuse and denounce slavery and slaveholders, wrote an Alabama editorialist. Yet our slaves are clothed with Northern manufactured goods, have Northern hats and shoes, work with Northern hoes, plows, and other implements, are chastened with Northern-made whips, and are working for Northern more than Southern profit. Of particular annoyance to such commentators was the tendency of some Northern abolitionists to denounce slave-grown commodities while simultaneously selling manufactured goods to plantation purchasers. The same men who, quote, declare they will not wear the cotton of the South because it has been cultivated by slaves, feel no qualms of conscience to sell Southern planters their boots and shoes, their Negro cloth, and all the etc. that make up a cargo of Yankee notions, and put the money arriving from the labor of slaves into their own pockets. This was the observation of a Baltimore minister. But moving beyond the particular politicization of this interregional trade on the part of New England abolitionists and Southern slaveholders, we probably need a few minutes to get a better sense of the broader American culture of business in the middle decades of the 19th century. And I would argue that antebellum America stands out as the era of caveat emptor, let the buyer beware, a wholesale shifting of responsibility onto the purchaser of goods and services who must protect him or herself from being cheated in a market economy that was increasingly characterized by one-off transactions between strangers. This was, for example, the age of P.T. Barnum, who turned the experience of being tricked from a source of indignation to a pleasurable commodity to be purchased at the door of a museum filled with improbable humbugs. This was the moment when Alexis de Tocqueville came to the United States and found a society characterized by the stubborn refusal of most white men to respect formal expertise. You think you're better than me? Could effectively have been the slogan of a democratic society where judging for yourself was indeed a testament to your equality. This was the age of Melville's confidence man, antebellum America's Nigerian prince, whose entire ploy was predicated on the idea that no one could be trusted in the big city. But you can trust me, and I trust you, and because I trust you, I'm going to volunteer that I'm in a bit of a pickle regarding a kind of commercial, lucrative financial venture. And indeed, because we have this mutual trust, I feel very confident letting you in on it. And if you can keep this discreet, and I trust you will, you can trust me to make big things happen for you. So because we trust one another, let's just go down to this pawn shop. And if you could take your watch and turn that into $50, I'm sure it's all going to work out very well. These kinds of things were crucial to the world of business in this period. This was also the age of the mercantile agency, the forerunner to modern credit rating, wherein to compensate for the general untrustworthiness of one's fellow Americans, as well as for the risks inherent to interregional trade, any savvy man of business, say in New York, would gladly pay an annual subscription to find out whether his potential customer, say in Buffalo, was a reliable bet. Thanks to a network of local informants who returned useful information back to New York City, information then recorded in enormous red leather books that an army of clerks copied into and out of, you could find out that the dry good merchant that you were interested in on Lake Erie was known to drink only infrequently, refused to do business on the Sabbath, had a wife who led the ladies' auxiliary of the local branch of the American Bible Society, kept a respectable home, but also had a brother-in-law who once did find himself deep in debt and absconded to Texas, leaving all of his creditors empty-handed. And this was information that then you could purchase and use to decide whether or not the $500 of merchandise you were about to send there would in fact be repaid in due course. By the mid-1840s, the mercantile agency had some 700 local informants and information on perhaps 20,000 firms of individuals. By 1860, the competing firms R.G. Dunn and Company and the Bradstreet Company had data on some 200,000 establishments across the North, data that transformed social and cultural capital into confidence and thus into financial capital. This variety of risk management, commercialized risk management, in fact, makes a great deal of sense to anyone who has surveyed the legal dockets of this period, the civil suits pitting businessmen against businessmen. Right, whale oil misrepresented as a higher grade on the docks of New Bedford. You didn't use the Southwark oleometer, did you? Or cases of unsaleable rubber shoes imported from Brazil by a Salem, Massachusetts merchant who failed to inform his customers of the meltability of such products in the pre-vulcanized era. These kinds of cases abound and give us a good deal of insight into a world in which fraud and chicanery was assumed to be par for the course. Meanwhile, at the heart of the American monetary system of this era, banknotes, paper banknotes, declared their own redeemability in a quantity of gold and silver that was rarely to be found in the vaults of the issuing institutions. And as the working class hard money opponents of paper money made clear during the so-called bank wars of the 1830s, paper money was fundamentally fraudulent and inherently misrepresentational, since there would always be more of it in circulation under the logic of fractional reserve banking than there would be specie that it purported to stand for. And so just as Andrew Jackson was obliterating the regulatory regime that might have once kept private banks from issuing yet more paper money, so too did municipalities in places like New York, Philadelphia, and Baltimore deregulate important elements of the consumer economy, ending, for example, the bread assize that had legislated the weight and price of loaves in sale for any of these urban markets and keeping bakers in check. This was presumably, initially, the assize was intended to protect consumer access to a dietary staple, but bakers and their allies by the 1820s and 1830s were arguing that the market would regulate itself more effectively. Customers could better determine value and quality with their spending rather than municipal officials armed with scales and a fine docket. So in sum, there was a lot of happening in the middle decades of the 19th century, almost all of it having some bearing on business ethics of some sort or another. But what should be clear is that in this terrain, a lot was up for grabs, and it wasn't clear where this was going to go, whether we were going to end up in a regime that was going to, in fact, going to accelerate the imposition of moral expectations on businessmen, or whether the kind of vision that someone like Jonathan Bailey had, which is to say business is a separate realm of human society with its own rules, and this was good, this was yet to be determined. So I want to pause at this moment in the talk for a bit of a scholarly detour into how we write the history of business ethics. And I hope you'll indulge me if this seems a little bibliographical, but I do want to identify several texts that have been helpful for me, and which I hope will be helpful for others in this audience as they might pursue these questions both historically and to think about them in the present. So Gabriel Abend, a sociologist at the University of Göttingen, published The Moral Background in 2014, a revision of his Northwestern University doctoral dissertation, and an argument for historicizing business ethics by focusing on the institutional and cultural structures that condition moral decision-making at a given time and place. To use a memorable, if peculiar, example from the book, before we can spend our time debating whether or not gazpacho is good or bad, we should devote some energy to determining whether it's on the menu and how it came to be there. That is, in fact, the moral background that he is referring to, the things that create the criteria that precede judgment. Focusing on the post-Civil War and the 20th century United States, Abend focuses on business ethicists and educators who contended that morality itself, or that morality was an end unto itself, versus those who contended that morality was a means to an end, specifically the end of augmented financial returns, with the latter group coming to gain authority at the expense of the former with the institutionalization of this objective morality within business school curricula at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century. Abend, as I read him, points to the moral background as the terrain on which business decision-making takes place, and that terrain, he argues, is constantly being reshaped and resculpted. A second text I want to draw your attention to is by Priya Satya, a historian at Stanford, who embeds business ethics not just in formal and informal rules, but also in the geopolitics of nation and empire. Her focus is on Imperial Britain's preeminent arms manufacturer, the Birmingham gunmaker Samuel Galton Jr., whose fellow Quakers took issue with his enabling of war in the 1790s. Galton, in turn, argued that the imperial war effort infiltrated every segment of the British economy, that the war machine, if you will, was a structure that infiltrated every segment of the British economy. It encompassed everyone and left no space for any individual to opt out. Armaments emerged along a long value chain of remotely sourced components, of extended networks of credit, of dispersed labor. So who could really say who made a gun? And Satya contends that modern capitalism's birth was in this crucible of war, colonialism, and slavery, and this indeed shaped, if not skewed, the forms of moral reasoning available and opened opportunities for a kind of creative self-deception that nonetheless asks more of us than to dismiss people in the past as mere hypocrites. In her recent presidential address to the Business History Conference, my friend and colleague from Providence College, Professor Sharon Murphy, explored the history of doing business in the public interest, noting that the public interest is shifting terrain, that the public is almost never a synonym for everyone, or even for most people, and that firms might pursue any number of socially harmful policies under the auspices of the public interest. Redlining to enforce residential segregation, for example, or personnel policies that terminated the employment of married women. These policies were socially bad for the bottom line. And Murphy cites the decision in 2014 of CVS to stop selling tobacco products as a rare example of a firm acting in the public interest, even in the potential, if only short-term, to the potential, if only short-term detriment of their financial prospects. But she notes that corporations are people, and that no matter how many other explanations might be available for the decision of a given firm, strategic repositioning, prevailing headwinds, whatever it might be, the resulting choices to lay off middle managers or to move production to a right-to-work state or to locate an AI center here rather than there belong to nameable human beings. It's a useful call for history that avoids reproducing the obfuscatory language of the market and forces us to focus on human actors and indeed to name them. Finally, Lucia Holsetter, a religious studies scholar at Skidmore College who has spent this year teaching on our campus, has written a powerful critique of the very premise of socially responsible capitalism, recognizing the ways in which critique of labor practices, of environmental degradation, of wealth hoarding, are transformed into a commodity themselves and then put in the service of making capitalism stronger. Quote, power reproduces itself through performances of self-critique, historical awareness, and progressive repair, Holsetter writes. Conscious consumerism in the North, or in the global North, and worker cooperatives in the global South aren't undermining capitalism so much as naturalizing its facile equation of market access and human freedom, its notion of creditworthiness as a marker of belonging to the human family, and in her words, a confusion of inclusion and emancipation. Capitalist humanitarianism, explains Holsetter, runs on stories, and she calls for us to focus on the narrativizing of fair trade and microfinance, which will lead us to the uncomfortable conclusion that there simply may be no such thing as ethical consumption under capitalism. So let me then use these four texts to point to a history of business ethics that combines these approaches. From Abend, we might be attentive to the institutional, right? The relationship of the formal and informal rules that structure systems of exchange and shape the terrain on which decisions will be made. From Satya, an attention to the geopolitical claims of nation and empire on the making of modern capitalism and the assimilation of business decision-making into that structural context. From Murphy, a constant attention to people as decision makers and a refusal to allow abstract forces to euphemistically explain real choices made by real nameable people. And from Holsetter, a warning not to drink the Kool-Aid. So with that, let me pivot back to the interregional trade in plantation goods. And I'd like to introduce you to Rhode Island's Roland Gibson Hazard, someone who once called himself, by descent, by the interests of business and the ties of friendship, more closely allied with the South than any other man in this House, that is to say the Rhode Island legislature, and perhaps in the state as a whole. This was a floor speech that he gave denouncing the Fugitive Slave Act. And this took place several years before Hazard attended the first national convention of the Republican Party in 1856 to support John C. Fremont, whose name you remember from where we began. Hazard was also Rhode Island's #1 manufacturer of woolen cloth and clothing for enslaved people to wear in the cotton fields and cane brakes of the plantation South. He and his older brother, Isaac, were crucial players in the integration of the American economy, linking the industrializing North and the expanding plantation frontier in a symbiotic rather than an antagonistic relationship from the 18 teens into the 1850s. I think about this synergy in the book Plantation Goods in a two-pronged way. I think about the ways in which Southern slaveholders outsourced the manufacturing of crucial infrastructural supports for their agricultural labor exploitation, and they found willing suppliers of these goods in the North rather than devoting their own resources or their own labor force to things like spinning or weaving or blacksmithing that might have been done by enslaved people on plantations in the Upper South. And while they were outsourcing this to a New England that was very keen on bringing this kind of industry into its own communities, New England manufacturers and merchants were functionally offshoring their slavery. That is to say, looking for spaces where they could continue to reap the benefits of human commodification and extreme labor exploitation without themselves having to be involved directly in the buying, selling, and beating of their fellow Americans. Entrepreneurs, people like the Hazards, usually without much capital or advanced machinery, transformed numerous New England communities, like those you see here, including the Hazards, South Kingstown, Rhode Island, into nodes of the plantation economy. And by the late 1830s, their price list for New Orleans attested to the scope of their business, the diversity of their product line, and to their particular innovation of mobilizing the sewing labor of rural Rhode Island women in order to make enslaved Louisianans some of the first Americans to wear ready-made clothing. So in the book, I spend a great deal of time trying to figure out what made someone like Roland Gibson Hazard tick, as it follows him from his Quaker education at the Westtown Friends School in Pennsylvania to becoming the nation's foremost supplier of Negro cloth that he hawked during plantation-to-plantation sales trips that brought him into regular contact with the enslaved wearers of his goods. He and his slaveholding customers shared a sense of themselves as paternalists, men of business whose prudence and care, presumably, or so they would claim, allowed for those who might otherwise have less, impoverished New England farming families, enslaved African descended families, to have more, both in material and in spiritual terms. Hazard would have used a strange term to describe himself. If we were to interview him and say, Mr. Hazard, how do you think of this? Surely you understand that you are skimming profit atop a corrupt system of human exploitation. He would say, I'm guessing. What are you talking about? I'm a philanthropist. And you would look at him and be like, a philanthropist? Excuse me? And he would say, well, absolutely. Hear me out, right? What do I do? Through the labor that I've created for my own community, I've vastly increased the material standard of living of all these rural families in southern Rhode Island who previously were living in extreme poverty. And as a result of their rising standard of living, all of a sudden, they're going to church, they're sending their kids to school, they're joining temperance societies. We're amidst a moral reformation. And meanwhile, not only have I done this, I have provided warm and durable clothing that has eased the suffering of the slave. And indeed, I don't want slavery to persist, and I don't want enslaved people to suffer. But until we can do something to work this out, isn't it a good thing that I'm providing clothing that protects their bodies in the fields and makes sure that they don't become sick from the morning miasmas? He would go on and on and on. But his notion of himself as a philanthropist tells us a lot about the ways in which different kinds of Americans might square this circle. His business was surprisingly unpoliticized and demoralized, if you will, to the extent that New England's abolitionists rarely called out people like Roland Gibson Hazard and the other manufacturers of these goods. Yet many of their southern customers paying them in cotton, it is clearly the case that the Hazards had as much at stake in the price of a bale of cotton as any slaveholding planter. Because they conducted business largely on credit, they urgently gathered intelligence on the state of the cotton crop, and this would determine whether or not they would receive payments 6 or 8 months later. Whatever efforts they may have made to categorize what they marketed as Negro cloth as a morally neutral or even a morally beneficial commodity, the day-to-day exigencies of managing their accounts made it impossible to avoid the most morally fraught aspect of slavery, the buying and selling of actual people. Quote, I carried 10 slaves to New Orleans, which I left there to be sold, reported one of their indebted customers from Mobile, Alabama, who wanted to demonstrate his good faith effort to cover his bills. This was presumably more information than people like the Hazards wanted. Perhaps it was a subtle message to these Rhode Islanders to back off. Did they really want to be responsible for pulling the trigger on a slave sale? But it was in fact the case that the mechanics of collecting overdue payments from Southern slaveholders was the most immediate place where business ethics emerged for Northern firms involved in this plantation provisioning business. We might consider the New York City Shoe Company that sent a man named David Martin to the South to collect bills in 1851. His instructions read, go direct route to New Orleans, stopping at places along the river where we have got delinquents and done them up. David carried a small notebook containing the firm's accounts and information on each of the firm's delinquent customers. Quote, we want these men to pay up, his instructions read. If they can't do it, immediately sue them or take some other method of collecting from them what they owe us. As he traveled south over the next year, David gathered the names of the best lawyers in each town should legal action become necessary. Lawsuits only made sense if the person had property, so David had to gather intelligence, learning, for example, that it won't do to sue this particular Texas slaveholder because he keeps his slave property in his wife's name. In this case, the best strategy would be to go easy on him to coax him along. But somewhere along the way, David Marvin received a tip that he duly recorded in a little notebook that now sits in the archives of the New York Historical Society. Quote, "Negroes are good property to attach." And this advice made sense because slaves were the most liquid form of property in the antebellum South. In most states, the law made it more difficult for creditors to seize and sell farmhouses or lots. And during tough times, the value of that kind of fixed property could decline precipitously, and sheriff's auctions might generate only minimal revenue. But in contrast, the bodies of enslaved men, women, and children could be sold with minimal legal entanglement, regardless of whether a political state categorized slave property as real, as personal, movable or immovable, actionable in chancery or in law courts. And more importantly, the price of slaves only seemed to rise. Land prices were determined locally, but the price of slaves were set in a far broader market, stretching from Baltimore to New Orleans to St. Louis. And that's when we go back to David Marvin's little notebook on a Texas businessman. It is said by some that this tyrant is a rascal. Others say he's a very honest man and has considerable property, said to own 40 Negroes, which some say is not commatable as they are in his wife's name. Look at that neologism, commatable, right? This captures the basic logic of the plantation collections game. And this business was competitive enough that no single Northern firm could force Southern customers into signing mortgages or other formal instruments to ensure prompt repayment. And also, slaves did not have to be formally collateralized to provide the creditworthiness that their owners needed to do this interregional business. A capitalized labor force did not merely provide low-cost labor, but stored wealth that could be readily converted into cash and into credit. And taken to its logical conclusion, Northern businesses entered the slave market with every sale of hoes, of shirts, and shovels on credit terms. It was this intimate interregional connection that gained the most attention. It did not go unnoticed by pro-slavery apologists who attributed most slave sales to greedy Northern creditors, or by abolitionists who took great pleasure, for example, in the 1837 bankruptcy of 3 Newark, New Jersey whip manufacturers whose Southern customers had defaulted in the recent panic. A decade later, a Massachusetts state legislator from Worcester, a man named Peter Bacon, introduced a bill that would prohibit any state resident from entering into a contract whose execution might result in a slave sale. Not surprisingly, the bill never made it out of committee, but attested to the increasing recognition that the interregional trade in plantation goods did situate Northern firms in the family separations that were thought to be the most fraught, if not most evil aspects of American chattel slavery. Pivot for a second to talk about how Southern slaveholders thought about things. The superintendent of the Sumner Manufacturing Company in Tennessee, Enoch Stedman, was taken back one day when he was approaching the town pump in 1857. A group of enslaved men had congregated there, a regular enough occurrence, but Stedman's keen textile eye was drawn to their plaid clothing. Slaves wearing plaid was a regular enough occurrence, but he was suspicious of these patterns. Why? Because he could trace them back to the small village of Stonington, Connecticut. And while he may have known very little about the labor that brought those plaids into being, the impoverished New England women who wove merchant-supplied yarn into cloth that they then returned for store credit, but he knew Stonington for a different reason. That community had just hosted a political rally on behalf of John C. Fremont, the Republican Party candidate for president in 1856, and this was unforgivable. Basically, Stedman then called for the textiles made by quote-unquote manufacturing abolitionists to be shunned, and that doing so would allow Southerners to, quote, make themselves independent of those fanatics who are seeking every occasion to accomplish our ruin. Southern commercial advertising latched on to this point. Why foster the pride and arrogance of our oppressors by buying Northern articles when Southern men are manufacturing superior articles at low prices? Read the appeal of one South Carolina shoemaking enterprise. The Columbia, South Carolina textile manufacturer James C. Gibbs, whose ad you see here, was even more explicit in this full-page display. Quote, merchants and planters will find it to their benefit to purchase their goods of us in preference to the trashy northern goods that annually flood our markets. Gibbs had recently won a prize from the State Agricultural Society of South Carolina for the best-made Osnaburgs, and now he marketed his kerseys and Negro cloth in the service of Southern economic independence. Encourage home enterprise, he implored. Several strategies presented themselves to Southerners in order to achieve that end, most tantalizingly what one scholar, Lawrence Glickman, has called rebel consumerism, in which the South would simply cut off their northern suppliers, withholding commercial patronage until their political antagonists fell into line. Innovating on the traditional boycott and gesturing to emerging practices of credit reporting, Southern partisans imagined a new kind of information technology to guide businesses towards firms where, quote, the rights of the South are acknowledged and respected. The mere existence of this widely publicized register of all the manufacturing abolitionists, a black book of firms whose principles might have supported Fremont in the 1856 presidential election, was sure to, quote, silence their insolence. So, as we think about Northerners who are involved in making plantation goods and trying to market these things in the South and coming into conflict when they become the legal owners of slaves through debt suits, but really rarely otherwise, and Southern partisans who are irritated at being taken advantage of people who they see as moral hypocrites, where in this mix might we find the articulation of a business ethics that would separate the market into its own distinct realm of experience where normal rules did not apply? Notably, and perhaps this is the great irony of this talk and why at least one of my friends who saw when it was announced said, that's kind of funny, antebellum origins of American business ethics. It was the people who were doing what we see as the least ethical thing as possible, owning other human beings, who were the least likely to argue that business should remain an amoral realm of competition where the market impartially picks the winners and other considerations don't intrude. It was Northern businessmen who were at the forefront of making this claim through their involvement in this trade, not the Southerners who were in fact doing what many people thought was inherently immoral. Northern businessmen generally considered slaveholders to be shady businessmen, and abolitionists often denounced slaveholders as, of course, fundamentally immoral. Slaveholders, in turn, denounced Northern businessmen as immoral, both for their embrace of the market as a just arbiter of social relations and for their hypocrisy vis-a-vis slavery. How, Southern slaveholders asked, could it be moral to treat workers as disposable and leave them to die in the streets, which you might see in New York or Boston or Philadelphia, whereas slavery functioned, as they would put it most perversely, as a kind of cradle-to-grave welfare? Northerners would come to see themselves as the victims of slavery, and they might not support the institution's expansion or its incursion on Northern civil liberties, but certainly not with embracing the idea that slavery should be ended, and certainly not with the idea that emancipated people should become equal citizens in a free United States. Southerners responded with commercial coercion, and Northerners responded in turn with the claim that business was here, and religious, political, moral questions were there, and everyone was best served when they were kept apart. Again, we see the ways in which this business could be politicized, and this is an image from an anti-slavery almanac for children, where each of the alphabet's 26 letters was connected to a short verse that would remind people of slavery's immortality. And yet, it was the people who were in effect being called out here, the merchants of the North, who would be most adamant that, in fact, this was not really correct logic, that the correct logic was business ethics and the market as its own realm of experience, and everything else separate from one another. Certainly, this emerges in the politics of the 1850s, around, say, the Fugitive Slave Act, which was when the United States government brought forth legislation that called on Northern citizens to participate under coercion of law in the recapture of fugitive slaves who had made it across the Mason-Dixon line. As New Englanders and Mid-Atlantic folks in New York and Pennsylvania took issue with the Fugitive Slave Bill, several firms in the South basically took up that consumer boycott idea and said that they would not, in fact, do business any longer with those businesses. Savvy entrepreneurial firms in New York caught wind of this, and you know what they did? they sent the names of those firms to the customers they wanted to cultivate so that they would do business with them rather than with these people who had dubious politics on the issue of slavery. Back and forth this went, and several New England and New York firms were called out as likely to lose their business because of their position politically. As a result, one New England manufacturing firm called Bowen and McNamee, with offices in New York, which sold silk, most importantly, took out an advertisement in a New York City paper, the Journal of Commerce. And the advertisement read as follows. The public, including the New York Journal of Commerce, are informed that we are silk merchants and keep an extensive and well-assorted stock of goods which we offer to responsible buyers on reasonable terms. As individuals, we entertain our own view on the various religious, moral, and political questions of the day, which we are neither afraid nor ashamed to declare on all proper occasions. But we wish it distinctly understood that our goods and not our principles are in the market. And this kind of language begins to proliferate by the end of the 1850s as the sectional conflict intensifies. More and more New Englanders will talk about the ways in which they want to sell boots, not principles. You see this in correspondence between Southern slaveholders and their New England suppliers all the way through the 1860 presidential election and the secession winter. This language becomes prevalent, which then returns us to Jonathan Bailey, who we met earlier, with his notion that political, religious, and moral questions are commodities that we do not deal in as a company. And I would thus posit that by the time he's writing this in 1856, this is a credible claim for those who needed to hear it. It would not necessarily find acceptance in the growing number of manuals for young men of commerce, which continued to focus on promise-keeping as the centerpiece of business ethics. Nor would it find much truck among northern clergy that remained skeptical of anyone's capacity to serve God and mammon equally. But this claim could not be dismissed out of hand either. It was not necessarily the Kuhnian paradigm shift in its entirety, but it certainly made that shift possible once the regulatory state grew in the wake of the Civil War and courts imbued corporations with the rights of people in the 1870s and 1880s. An irony such that just as corporations became people, people were increasingly instructed to behave as though they were corporations. That is to say, dehumanized and severed from the social relations that sustained human connection. So let me conclude with a few final thoughts. Let's jump ahead a few hundred years to the acronyms that figure so prominently in business education and practice today. ESG, environment, social, and governance, speaks to the criteria that are used to evaluate firms and investment vehicles beyond financial considerations exclusively. ESG gained traction during the 20-teens with firms embracing sustainability and fund managers pursuing socially responsible investing in accordance with what BlackRock CEO Larry Fink then called a sense of purpose. Fink's 2018 exhortation was soon followed a year later by the Business Roundtable's repudiation of shareholder value in exchange for a notion of stakeholder value that would be predicated on an obligation to customers, to employees, to suppliers, and communities. JP Morgan Chase's Jamie Dimon, in fact, led the 180 signatories of fellow CEOs on that document that posited a modern standard of corporate responsibility. That term, corporate responsibility, more typically travels under the acronym CSR, corporate social responsibility, defined by a Harvard Business School explainer as, quote, the idea that a business has a responsibility to the society that exists around it. Both ESG and CSR promised funds and firms the high likelihood of doing well by doing good. Disclosures and benchmarks would lure investors, while a favorable public image cultivated through environmental stewardship, unpolluted supply chains, and sensible philanthropy would boost brand value, motivate employees, and yes, increase share prices. The so-called triple bottom line of people, planet, and profit contended that it was in fact possible to have it all. From where we're standing here in 2025, I would dare say some of this looks quite quaint. And we may, in fact, as we think about that historical moment in the 20-teens, where this kind of discourse gained traction, and certainly in the wake of the summer of George Floyd, when more and more firms were coming to talk explicitly about their relationship to anti-Black racism as a structural factor in American society, that moment seems to be ending. And we all know well the various kinds of firms that have already pivoted away from that. And as we look at an administration that is largely positing or creating the structures for a kind of capitalism that is fundamentally lawless, then it's hard to know what business ethics will mean looking forward. That CSR ESG moment of the 2010s may provide a mere blip when it was possible to imagine one thing and yet larger forces pulled in another. So if we put that together with the history that I've told you today, I suppose the larger issue that we want to think about when we study the ethics of capitalism is not really how closely one can skate up to the edge of the law, because both then and now, there wasn't much of an enforcement mechanism. The state then and now had largely abdicated its capacity to decide what was legal and what was illegal. And so long as legality and illegality shaped what constituted business ethics, there was some certainty, if you will. The certainty of, say, going to jail for tax fraud or paying an enormous fine for the polluting that you have done. But now, as there isn't much law and there isn't much of an enforcement mechanism, I would dare say that 2025 might be looking more like 1825, a situation where ethical business behavior, and thus the ethics of capitalism, will rest on the decisions of individuals who I hope, with increasing certainty and with increasing confidence, will act in such a way that just because you can doesn't mean you should. Thank you very much for your attention. And we have time for questions, and there are microphones that will circulate because there's an online group watching this as well. So if you have a question, raise your hand and we'll deliver a microphone to you, and we can talk away.
Hello? Yes, it's on.
Great. Thanks, Seth. I wanted to ask if you think this is a peculiarly American story, because you posit slavery and, the relations between the North and the South as really the impetus for this articulation of this, business ethics are separate from social ethics. Is this something that is particularly American, or is something like this going on also, say, in other parts of the Western world at this time?
Yeah, it's a wonderful question, Amy. Thank you. On the one hand, these dilemmas are present and these conversations are present everywhere that market transformation is underway in the 18th and 19th century. And certainly, if we were to study the history of Great Britain at this moment as the sort of leading edge of modern capitalism, we would see these discussions left and right, and we would see the ways in which they took a particular kind of British turn, whether one constrained by the political structures that disfranchised most adult white men in ways that created different kinds of pressures on the regulatory state, or by virtue of the fact that slaveholding was something that was taking place thousands of miles away in the Caribbean rather than next door or at home. So I think in all of these cases, the discussions that are emerging around the boundaries of the market are present, and each of them will take their own particular institutional and local forms. I think there is, though, a reason, if you can allow, and I know I can anticipate that you will not, a reason for a kind of American exceptionalism here. And I think the reason for a kind of American exceptionalism here is because even as market transformation was underway in many parts of the Western world in this period, very few societies embraced this transformation as so fundamentally part of human liberation. Very few other places saw the market as, in fact, the thing that would create a democratic society. Very few places saw the market as the thing that would create an equality that didn't exist any other places in the world. And even if that was completely untrue, that fiction did hugely important cultural work to shape the terrain of commerce. And so the American story, I think, has its own particularities that I want to center here, because I think ultimately we are living in the wake of those choices rather than choices that we might have found in, say, Europe, where the pivot to social welfare in the middle of the 20th century might suggest radically different outcomes.
Hi, thank you, Seth. My question is about the 1850s in particular. Mm-hmm. What the prehistory is it a story about intensifying struggles over slavery in that moment? What is the why the 1850s are so pivotal here?
Right. So for many American historians who focus on the so-called sectional crisis, the accelerating kinds of divisions that lead us supposedly to an inevitable civil war. It really heats up after the acquisition of huge quantities of land from Mexico in the US-Mexico War. And the treaty that is signed in 1848 presents a series of political problems that will have to be solved through legislation in terms of the creation of new states at a moment when southern states and northern states have sought a very sort of careful balance within the distribution of seats in the Senate, and a whole series of other issues about whether or not it is possible for Congress to pass any legislation at all that would limit the expansion of slavery to those territories that had just been acquired from Mexico. And to that extent, a set of issues around slavery that could largely be sublimated as simply a status quo that the Missouri Compromise line of 1820 basically kept out of the realm of politics. By the 1850s, this is everywhere in politics, accelerated by politicians who see advantage in repealing such things, jurists like Justice Taney, who make decisions that ultimately deny Congress's ability to legislate on anything having to do with slavery, and simply it accelerates dramatically. So I do think the 1850s is the moment. The tariff debates in the late 1820s and early 1830s matter, but that's largely sewn up by 1833. It pops up again in 42, 46, but this is small potatoes relative to the issue of whether or not, in the most simple terms, Congress can pass a law declaring that slavery is legal or illegal in a given territory. Thank you.
Yeah, I guess I wanted to finger on Amy's question and push a little harder there.
Mm-hmm.
That capitalists want to sell boots and not principles is not unique to the American scene, and you don't have to go far to Dickens to see, or E.P. Thompson to look at the struggles over the moral economy of capitalism and the resistance to it. So where in the American case do you locate? I mean, I'm sympathetic, really sympathetic at the particular fervency of this separation, and how does it get institutionalized off the back of the practices that you're describing with respect to northern companies not wanting to take over, admit to owning slaves? Right?
Mm-hmm. No, you're absolutely right to direct our attention to the kind of pressure from below in popular politics that calls capitalists out for their exploitative practices. And certainly the emergence of factory exploitation in Britain would be a case in point. And it is undoubtedly true, as you have suggested, that British manufacturers and capitalists are coming up with lots of elaborate justifications for why their behavior is ethical or why they shouldn't be judged for violating norms of society, even as working class people might contend a very different kind of model and a moral economy that you mentioned, one in which no one would believe under any circumstances that the market should be the ultimate and only arbiter of social relations. British capitalists, as I read them in the middle decades of the 19th century, are less forward in arguing that the market is the end and beginning. I see British capitalists as making more arguments that their business practices can be squared with ethical and moral considerations, that their stewardship of the working class, their ability to provide jobs to people who might not otherwise have them, even as self-delusional as that might be, creates a different kind of discourse than the one I see in the United States. I'm happy to be wrong about this, and certainly I think more comparative research would be beneficial to this project as a whole. But I do think there is something about the ways in which slavery is creating this discussion in the United States, shaping its terrain in churches, in legislatures, and at the ballot box, that ultimately calls into being, or summons, I should say, a particular kind of separate spheres claim that is louder here and more thoroughly articulated here than in other places along the comparable pathway of capitalist development. You have a question here.
Thank you for the talk. It was very informative and engaging. I have, I think, 3 questions. I'll start small to bigger, I guess. Okay. The first one is, near the beginning, you mentioned something about something being dystopian, or it would have been viewed as dystopian. I don't remember the exact phrasing, but I think I was caught in terms of like, I wasn't entirely sure how that would be more dystopian than chattel slavery. And then my next question is, I guess also speaking to this, the question of sort of broader Western culpability, is I'm not entirely sure how the like European mid-20th century social welfare model is like different from what we've been taught, like what you were just speaking about that the Northerners were doing. The European social welfare model is itself predicated on this exact sort of dissonance between the sort of source and reality of the welfare and the money for the welfare and the access to capital that provides welfare for predominantly white Western countries. Like, I'm not sure how that is distinct from the sort of mental gymnastics that the Northerners were doing. Of course, not to, like, I understand obviously the sort of uniqueness of chattel slavery, but I think in terms of this broader question of how far this rhetoric underpins the entire West, I'm wondering if you could elaborate on that. And then my third question, and I guess my most important, is I wonder where Black people are in this, especially enslaved people. I wonder, I don't know. It felt like there was a pretty severe, like, they were very conspicuously missing in the talk for me. I find myself wondering about what enslaved people in the South were writing and saying about this dissonance, how they were understanding their relationship to Northern goods, how free Black people in the North, or the few that were in the South, would, like, how they were thinking about these things. They were, after all, the ones who were the crux and the most consistent members of the abolitionist societies that you referenced, but they're not here. They're also often they also did a lot of initial wage labor in the North. So I'm wondering about that. I'm wondering about how free Black people in the South who may have been slave owners are thinking about this business ethics and that entire mess. I don't know. I just feel like there's a lot of capacity for Black people's thoughts on this. And like I know like a bit, but I guess not sure if you've thought about that as well.
Yeah, no, thank you for all three of those good questions that I'm happy to offer clarifications on. You're right. Early in the talk, I mentioned that the discourse that was emerging in the North was one that would have thought that a world that exists on the textbooks of principles of economics class, one that or is presumed that the world is made up of atomized, self-interested, utility maximizing actors, they would have thought that was indeed dystopian. That did not mean that they wouldn't have thought slaveholding was dystopian, although many of these commentators did not think slaveholding was dystopian, but rather thought that this was a mode of spreading Christianity to so-called heathen peoples, and took great pleasure in the notion that this was to the greater good of a Christian sort of reformation of the globe itself and a hastening of the second coming of Christ. I don't mean to create a false choice between slavery dystopian and the atomized world of the Econ 101 textbook. These both can be dystopian, and I hope you'll hear me as saying that both of them, in my opinion, are of course dystopian. On the second issue of European sort of social welfare in the 20th century, if I understand you correctly, you're suggesting that the kind of capacity to provide for citizens in a society, to provide them with healthcare, to provide them with public education, to provide them with a reasonably high standard of living at the expense of the state, is in fact predicated on histories of enslavement, histories of colonialism, and the mass taking of the wealth of the rest of the world and its consolidation in Europe, 100%. But that said, that model of social welfare is one that is rather different from one that would emerge in a United States that was largely consistent or largely comfortable with the idea that corporations could play a larger role than the state, and that the private sector could, in fact, on its own accord and through its own behaviors, provide for basically the needs of a growing population. The welfare model that emerges in post-World War II Europe is predicated on something quite different, and anyone who has visited Europe in recent years can very much recognize the ways in which those investments in public infrastructure or the costs of public education, whatever it might be, in fact look different because of a set of policy choices. And I think that's worth noting here too. On the final issue, and certainly the most important one, it is totally fair to ask, where are Black people in this story? And it is the case that in the book itself, this is, in fact, the most important part of the book. And the way that the book is structured is it moves from sort of the New England communities where these goods are made to the southern spaces that they are used. It culminates in plantation space, and it culminates in the ways in which enslaved men and women incorporate these northern manufactured goods into their own politics, their own strategies of resistance, and ultimately their own collective action that will feed into the process of self-emancipation that emerges at the time of the Civil War. The chapters of the book that end up in plantation space, I think, are probably the best ones in the book. And I would urge people to take a look at them. It's also the case that the book begins in a rather remarkable moment that in some ways captures the spirit of this. It begins in a Charleston store in 1825, where Isaac Peashazard from Rhode Island is there to sell clothing to Southern slaveholders. Into the store come a group of 20 enslaved men to complain about the goods. And they complain to Isaac Peashazard's face, and they tell him this stuff is crap. This stuff doesn't protect our bodies in the fields. This stuff hasn't lasted 2 months, and we demand something better. And it's that confrontation where Isaac Peashazard then writes home, where he says, I couldn't convince them otherwise. We had to give them better things. Gives a sense of enslaved people as active participants in this consumer marketplace, and whose decisions about what was acceptable and what was not acceptable would ultimately come to shape manufacturing regimes thousands of miles away. So in the book as a whole, I hope you would be satisfied with the way that this is dealt with. On the issue of business ethics, though, I'm afraid that I will have a disappointing answer, which is that although it is true that Black Northerners were crucial parts of the abolitionist movement, they did not have a great deal of critique for this line of business, so much as they had a critique for the fundamental illegitimacy of slavery itself. Northern free people in the South did not have a particular critique of the kind of business interconnections that made it onto the page. And of course, that is an artifact of, in many cases, the forced illiteracy of the plantation, as many people moved from conditions of bondage to conditions of freedom. It is a factor of lack of access to public vehicles for conveying ideas, which is certainly part of the anti-Black structures of American society at this time. But I don't think it's simply that we can't hear. It is largely that I think if we're trying to create an origin story for an American business ethics that claims that the market is here and everything else is over there, we're probably unlikely to find a lot of Black Americans saying, yeah, that sounds right. And that Black American voices on this issue would be much more likely to be articulating a kind of set of what we might call moral economy positions that would claim that, in fact, other circumstances, other forces need to bind people together in commonality and to organize social relations, that the market, in fact, is particularly unreliable, precisely because the experience of enslavement over several hundred years at that point would convince anyone who was paying attention that market freedom went hand in hand with human commodification and could as easily lead to more people being sold rather than more things being sold, or a kind of liberation that would appeal or affix to the broadest segment of the population.
Yeah, that was my question too. So thanks for the question. I guess I'll just say, Seth, I appreciate your talk here. It's fascinating to hear such a wonderfully historically balanced or attempt at balancing this real complicated and morally fraught moment or set of moments, right? Like, so I was listening for words like profiteers and greed and moral timidity and cowardice, right? But you stay away from those kinds of claims. So I guess I want to salute you for that. At the same time, I want to, I guess, generate a related question, which is to say, do you find in your research much overlap between, you started with some ministers, I think, you said that there were some moral precepts that were guiding some of the materials in the early part of you started out with that. Mm-hmm. But I guess as this thing tracks to 1859 and 1860, is there any evidence in the historical record? And here I'm going to ask you to track it racially as well, right? Because we got 250,000 free Black folks in the North, 250,000 free Black folks in the South. We have Black businesses everywhere. And we have, of course, the national organizations that are denominations, say AME Church, AME Zion Church, CME Church, Baptist churches. Did you find anything in those historical records that gave you some overlaps to help you, that might have affirmed this distinction between the separation between business and the goods in the market and the principles outside of it?
Right. No, this is a fair question. I want to say on the first thing about sort of even-handed. I think in some ways that is a historian's prerogative, right? Which is not to say, oh, everyone in the past was equal and who are we to judge, but rather that our starting point should not be that we are morally superior to them. I don't think we are. And in fact, if I have any relationship to the history of business ethics or the larger sort of discussion of this interregional trade in the book, it is fundamentally my sense that we will be judged very harshly 200 years from now. Even as we think we're good people, our hypocrisy will be called out left and right. Our sense that we're making good choices because we're using paper straws and at the same time flying, whatever it might be. The fact that we see certain kinds of exploitation and act on it, but can't give up our iPhones despite our knowledge of the rare earth minerals and the slavery that goes into produce, right? We are all entangled. And in fact, the last 500 years of global economic integration has created these kinds of entanglements. And I don't think there's an easy way out, and I don't think there ever has been. But to that extent, I think my sensibility as a scholar is to try to understand these people on their own terms, to try to understand the ways in which they squared the circle without necessarily trying to say, ha, 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 look at these dupes, look at these rubes, look at what they're doing here. I don't think that's good historical practice. But good historical practice is, of course, to cast the widest net into the sources that one is using. And so I appreciate the second part of your comment, which is to say, what would we find if we were looking at, say, the so-called colored convention movements of the 1840s and 1850s? What would we find if we were reading the Black press as you move towards the coming of the Civil War? What would we find if we were reading the letters of Black businessmen in various kinds of places? It is my sense from my survey of those things that we're not going to find much different than the standard moral claims that business should be operated under the precepts of the Golden Rule. This sort of the kind of business model that is informed by Christian ethics, that is determined or is characterized best by promise keeping, and again, do unto others, was in fact the most prominent mode of business ethics among the Black population and among the religiously committed pastorate and others who were putting their ideas into print in this period. It's a very small group of merchants who are engaged in this interregional trade, who are white and who are tied into the plantation market, who are the ones who are putting forth this new mode of thinking about separation. And indeed, this is a talk that is focused on that new mode of thinking that posits that separation. And so my attention naturally went to the people who were in fact articulating this kind of claim. And I don't know that it is a claim that we would find beyond a relatively small cadre of businessmen in New York who are tied to interregional trade. But it is my conviction that that group of people puts out a language that will come to have enormous importance in the decades that follow for exactly the reasons I said, because of the rise of the regulatory state in the wake of the Civil War, and because of the sort of creation of the corporate personhood, that creates a world in which this new conception can really take off in ways that it might not have found as many adherents in 1858, 1859, or even 1860.
So first, I want to say I agree with you on the question of American exceptionalism on this front, and I would add another layer to why we have that American exceptionalism.
Please.
That we have this very, very strong myth of the self-made man that goes back throughout American history, and this individualism, this sense of that pulling yourself up by your own bootstraps. And we've all, not all, but most of us are, as a society, have drunk that Kool-Aid.
We have Benjamin Franklin, they don't.
Yes. And I think that overlays very nicely with the story of capitalism and this separation of capitalism from ethics. So I think that plays into that story. My question, I'm going to force you to do the ahistorical, and how do we think about business ethics going forward in this moment where it seems like that has become one of the bad words that needs to be removed from all databases? How do we look forward when we seem more like 1825 than 2025 right now?
Yeah, I don't have a quick answer for that. Not surprisingly, it is quite shocking that that ways of talking about business as again as corporate social responsibility or environment, social and governance as commonsensical 5 years ago to now on the banned list is quite shocking, and the degree to which I won't be shy in saying, being run by a rogue government that has taken down its regulatory apparatus and also instituted the most blatant kinds of corruption that we can imagine in a political system in which money is leading directly to access and to the writing of legislation that is benefiting a very small number of people. It is incumbent upon us to not count on the law and to not count on law enforcement to do the work of people policing people. And I think a lot about this as an educator, particularly as I've spent the last couple of months watching these young men in Doge coming into various government offices and doing stuff with a recklessness that seems to me to be an indictment of our education system. And that notion of just because you can doesn't mean you should. I would like to have inscribed on the sort of entry of every school building, and I would like it to become very much part of how we're talking to young people these days, to recognize that there are choices and they get to make the choices. I mean, we're constantly butting up against things that fly in the face of that. I saw recently, a Columbia student who was touting a new sort of AI I don't know what to call it, platform or mode of doing business ed. If everyone's doing it, it's not cheating anymore, right? And I think that can't be the world we inhabit. I guess maybe to put it most crudely and in the spirit of Doge, if we could inscribe atop our computer science building in giant letters, "Don't be big balls," this would be the best thing we could do.
If I can jump in with one at this point, perhaps,
Yeah,
just building off of that, but not the last line. You're probably familiar with Albert Hirschman's wonderful book, The Rhetoric of Reaction. And he basically says that conservative arguments of all types could coexist at all times in three forms. There's a perversity thesis, that if you try and reduce poverty by spending money, you'll make people more poor. There's the jeopardy thesis, that if you go along this line of reform, you'll jeopardize the very thing you're trying to get to. And there's perversity, jeopardy, and I can't remember the last one, actually, there's another one. But I wonder if you have an equivalent here in what you've said today, because it seems that business ethics never really change, rather they circulate. So there's the one that you pointed out, the caveat emptor defense, right? Put the blame on the individual, which is why we have individual carbon footprints. It was made up by oil companies as a way of basically shoving responsibility from them onto us. So you can call that the strategy of externalization. There's the leaning into it and owning it, right? Which is essentially sort of, oh, come on, the slaves are much better with us, right? You can call that a strategy of sublimation. Right? And then there's a final one of separation, which is principles over here and products over there. And I wonder if it's the case that basically it's not so much that the world's changed, it's just that we put different emphasis on different rhetorical strategies of defense in different moments.
Yes, and that's what makes business ethics something that we can study historically, right? I mean, that is the very idea of what it is to historicize any set of ideas or any set of practices, is to recognize that none of this is fixed and none of this is predetermined, but that under the sort of convergence of various kind of cultural and social and political and economic conditions, people are able to reassemble the world in ways that suit the interests or needs of some people and certainly not all people. But I do, from sort of your reference to the kind of individuation of responsibility here, I mean, I do think that fits nicely with what Sharon had mentioned about a particular mode of American individualism and the ways in which the lack of various kinds of corporate identities within an American society that for now several hundred years has celebrated the self-made man, has celebrated the notion that the individual by striving can ascend and transcend the station of their birth. That is a sort of moral background, if you will, that makes it possible for all of these other kinds of arguments to flourish. And that might be the key to why the decisions or the kind of rhetoric that emerges, say, in the 1840s and 1850s, is not an indictment of the North as a whole. It is an indictment of a specific slaveholder or a specific merchant who has made a specific decision.
We have time for one more question. Some would like it. Is one more person?
Coming from someone who does human rights and due diligence space, what would you say in your research or in writing this book, did you feel like you would want to bring to, let's say, looking at legislation, looking at what Europe is doing with its corporate responsibility and due diligence reporting, which is the only legislative body that we have right now in the world that is saying that the separation model doesn't work. It's not sustainable. In your book and your research, what do you think resonated with you if you were to have that conversation to a practitioner here in the United States saying, there is something that we need to do differently by looking at the European model, and we can learn from the past?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that I have any particular insight that extends beyond the formulation that you've given it in the way that you framed this. We do have models in the world that give us a sense that it could be otherwise. We have an American political tradition that has largely been hostile to the idea that it could be otherwise. We have endless ways that are available to us, it would seem to me, to organize society differently, to allocate resources differently, to create different expectations of members of a society and of corporations in a society. We have chosen in this country to do the least rather than the most. And I think we are paying a very, very severe price for this. That is not a particularly profound insight. I think that is a statement of fact that doesn't require, again, a PhD or anything like that to articulate. But that said, it seems to me that this history, and this is I think where my strongest investments are in this history, is to have some sense of the dilemmas that organize modern life, particularly in the global north, are dilemmas that weren't invented with the WTO, didn't come online a couple years ago when we started learning about sweatshop-free sweatshirts. These are dilemmas that have been present in the Western world for the last 500 years and are a product of early modern global integration and the relationship of Africa, Europe, and the Americas through colonialism and slavery. And to the extent that those institutions created these long-distance relationships between consumers and producers, people have, for hundreds of years now, tried to think about what they can live with and what they can't, but also what they can see and what they can't see. And in thinking about this as something that changes from time and place to place and from person to person, it does leave me, as I said before, with a certainty that we are not better than people in the past, and people in the past are not better than us, but that we might think very carefully about how we are likely to be judged vis-a-vis the way that we are quick to judge people in the past. Thank you.
And with that, I'd like to thank all of you for attending this lecture and to thank Seth for a really enlightening talk. Thank you.